Hello everyone, this paragraph is all about the development of regions on our planet, and we're going to look at the development of these regions in different speeds. I would like to look at the following objectives. Why are there differences between countries in economic development? What are internal causes of poverty? What are external causes of poverty? What are human causes of poverty? And why does social inequality exist in less developed countries? So what's the reason for that? Well, at first I would like to look at why there are differences between countries in economic development. If you look at certain countries, you might notice that there are differences in economic development. We already looked at these countries, and you might have noticed that some countries, especially in Africa, tend to be less developed than countries, for example, in South America or in Europe. And if you're looking at poorer countries, you might notice that there are several causes which could cause this poverty in a country. And there are internal and external causes. And they could be negative. So if there are many negative causes at once in one country or in one region, the bigger the chance of poverty in that region. So you have to look at how this development takes place. And I would like to show you the different kinds of internal causes. First of all, when the following things are missing, it could lead to poverty. And of course, you might notice that some of these causes are available in Africa. So that could give you a reason to understand why the development goes not that fast over there. First of all, you need fertile soil, otherwise your crops won't grow. If you live in a mountainous area, which could be inhospitable, it's impossible to grow crops there or even build a city. Periods of drought. We are now facing an El Nino year, which means that in certain regions in Africa there is less rain than usually, or the other way around, there falls a lot of rain. And drought or flooding is one of the most important things when you're talking about climatology. So the climate is of great influence on the way a country can develop itself. If the country is a desert, of course, nothing grows there, so it cannot develop it in the way that it should. On the other hand, natural resources are needed as well. If a country does not have any natural resources, they cannot export them, so they can't make money out of it. That means, of course, that the prices of products are high because they have to import everything, and, well, of course, that makes it impossible for a country to develop itself. If a country is landlocked, the country does not have a coastal area. It means that it is locked in between other countries. So if it wants to trade, it always has to go through the other countries. It just can't get a boat in a harbour at sea and transport their goods everywhere around the world. And of course, if you are landlocked and there is no infrastructure, it is impossible to travel around your country, and you cannot sell your products to other countries because there is no connectivity. So all these kinds of things are internal and they can lead to poverty. So if a country would like to develop itself, it should think of these things. Do we have these things, and how can this help our country to develop? Then there are external causes. And what are external causes? Well, they are from abroad. That means that they're not from inside out. And for example, countries were colonized for trade or for industrialism in the past, and that means that there weren't any investments done in the country itself. The colony was just used for its sources, and these sources were taken away to Europe. And on the map you see the former British colonies, and you might notice that there are a lot of them in Africa. And you might wonder what had happened with all the ores and all the other products that could be made there, or their sources, the natural sources, well, they were all taken up by the UK and transported to the UK or sold on the market. And well, then you know, of course, what happens. These countries, after the colonization, the decolonization, didn't have anything left, so they could not develop themselves. If they do have products and they want to sell them, they might not be able to sell them because of the fact that Western countries protect their own markets. For example, there are countries in Europe which protect the markets for products from Africa, which means that actually we are protecting our markets, so products that can be made over here are being made over here and not being bought in Africa, because if we should do that, the countries there could export them to here and our companies are not able to produce them anymore. And of course, that is not good for our own market. And at last, the multinational organizations won't invest in the countries where the production is done. And this happens in Africa again. China built a railroad in, I suppose it was Ethiopia or in Kenya, or one of the two. And what happened was they said, well, we will build you this railroad and you don't need to pay for it, but we want some of your mineral resources for that. So that was what happened. But on the trains that are on the tracks there, Chinese people drive the trains, and in the mines it are Chinese people who are working there. They're taking out everything which they can use, and when they're done, they leave the railroad behind. No one can use it. It is unusable, and it's done. And the country itself has lost all of its mineral resources. Not a very nice idea. Then again, there are human causes of poverty, and in poor countries that most of the time is caused by less democracy. If there is a dictator, he decides or she decides what's going to happen in that country. Corruption, when the money does not, when it is not invested in the products where it belong to, but the money stays or ends up in the pockets of people who are actually rich enough. And on the other hand, you do have cronyism, which is called vriendjespolitiek in Dutch, and that means that a leader could ask a friend of his to build some product, or a factory, or houses, or a market, whatever, and the money stays in between them. So the money flows back to that leader. Of course, that does not help to give your economy a boost, which should be done through this kind of product. But okay. But how does it work in the more developed countries, in the richer countries? Well, most of the time they are democratic, so there is less corruption. Entrepreneurship is stimulated. If you want to open a shop, you are allowed to do that, and it's good for the economy. Private ownership is protected, so it means that you cannot just end in bankruptcy. You will be helped with that. Of course, our government has basic facilities like healthcare, and that is a task for the government. And every person can become richer or poorer, and that is of course possible because of the fact that there is an entrepreneurship over here. Again, in poorer countries there's another problem. When you look at the demographic graph on the right, the population graph, it shows you the amount of people with a certain age. And this is Niger in Africa, and you might notice that there are a lot of very young people and not a lot of old people. So that means if you're talking about the pressure on the working part of this, well, country is enormous, because there's so many children that don't work but cost a lot of money. And there are so less people which are working. There are not enough people working, and well, the result is that they have to pay for all the younger people. In the Netherlands, it's the other way around, and in Germany and Japan, we do have a lot of older people which are actually not working anymore, and that is what we call the grijze druk. And these people, they have to, of course, get their pensions and have to get everything they need, and of course that is pricey as well for the people who are working. So here you're looking at the groene druk, and that is a part of the population pressure, so the non-working part of a country versus the working part of the country. And the third slide about human causes, differences in prosperity and welfare in a country. That is very important. If you look at this map, you might notice that the welfare in Africa is way less than in Southern America, and even way less than in Europe and in America. And what you see on this map is actually the centrum periphery model. You can see that the Western countries are dark green, the semi-periphery countries are light green, and the periphery countries are purple. And that means that the development is not there yet. They still have to, well, actually be developed, so the well-being, the welfare is not there at this point of time. And of course you can look at the social inequality. And why does the social inequality increase when it develops itself? Well, in this case, if you look at countries in the world, you won't find this in the poorest countries because everyone is poor there. But the more a country gets developed, the more the social inequality increases. And you can see this the best in the countries which are in the semi-periphery. Why? Well, certain regions and certain people take advantage of the growing welfare. So that means that a certain group, a few people, the richer people, can develop themselves, get richer, and can invest in the city in which they are living, or the company which they own can invest. But the poorer part of the country does not develop itself, so the difference between poor and rich gets bigger. And if you want to visualize it, you have to use the Gini coefficient or the Lorenz curve. And on this picture here, this graph shows you the Lorenz curve. And what is that? Well, it's actually what you see, the line of equality or the line of inequality. How was the money distributed across the country, across a nation? Well, in this case, you see two lines, two graphs. And line A is perfectly in the middle of the graph. Well, that does mean that the distribution of money is equal, perfectly across the whole country. And this does not exist in real life because, of course, there are always a part of the population which is richer than the part of the other side which is poorer. And most of the time, the richest part of the population is smaller than the poorest part, but they gain more money than the rest of it. So you could create a line, for example, 70% is poor, but they get 30% of the money. And on the other hand, the 30% rich does have 70% of the money. So that is an inequality, and you can see that on this curve. And it's important that you can draw this, so you have to understand what's happening. If you do have economy, you might recognize this. If you don't, please ask, because this was the last slide. Well, I hope that you got an idea of what is happening between countries and why certain countries are poorer than the other ones, what internal and external causes and human causes of poverty are, and of course the last slide in which I've shown you why social inequality exists and why it's there in less developed countries but not in the poorest ones.